I grew to quite like Star Trek Enterprise over the course of its 4-year run. I'm generally not a fan of prequels, but I gave it a go and was pleasantly surprised by the very promising pilot, Broken Bow. Action-packed, cinematic, adventurous, and filled with potential. The reason Enterprise is not remembered as fondly by some Trek fans, as it probably should be in my view, has got to do with what followed the pilot, a rather lackluster first season, and a second season that wasn't much better. Now, it's a well-known fact that Star Trek series usually take about 3 seasons to reach their stride, and Enterprise was no different. But, if I'm honest, there was a recognizable gulf in quality between the first 2 seasons of Enterprise and the first 2 seasons of TNG, DS9, and Voyager. Also, the industry had changed a great deal. There were lots more TV networks for audiences to watch, so there was so much more choice, and consequently, the show was never going to be afforded the same leniency as its predecessors. Enterprise needed to hit the ground running with some solid stories, and it failed to do that. It didn't help that the writers had their hands tied by the network, who seemed more interested in churning out a kind of Voyager Light series, but with some more simplified storylines. And furthermore, the pacing of the episodes was incredibly slow. It was as if the showrunners of Rick Berman and Brannon Braga had forgotten how to produce a well-paced series. It wasn't all bad, of course. The first 2 seasons had a few solid installments, like the Andorian Incident, Cold Front, Shuttlepod 1, Shockwave, Carbon Creek, Minefield, Dead Stop, Future Tense, Judgment, Regeneration, First Flight, and The Expanse. But that's just 12 episodes from 52. The show's second major issue, beyond a lack of clear direction, was the fact that it simply wasn't behaving like a prequel and properly explaining much of the backstory and origin of the Star Trek legacy. That issue would, of course, be resolved in Season 4. But when Berman and Braga's backs were against the wall with the threat of cancellation upon them, they acted in the best possible way they could and produced a well-thought-out, season-long story in the form of the Xindi arc. I recognize this wasn't to everyone's liking, but I enjoyed Season 3 immensely. The narrative is extremely well constructed, the pacing was excellent, and some wonderful character development took place over the course of that year. Enterprise was always aided by the very best production values of the franchise, with fantastic sets and special effects. And these elements really came to the fore in Season 3. There were a lot of standout episodes that year for me, like The Xindi, The Shipment, Stratagem, Doctor's Orders, Damage, Azadi Prime, E Squared, Countdown, and 0 Hour. But the breakout stories were Twilight, a time travel story with echoes of Christopher Nolan's Memento, as well as TNG's Yesterday's Enterprise. North Star, which was a Western story and a welcome visual and thematic departure, the very moving similitude about a clone of Trip Tucker, and Carpenter Street, a contemporary urban tale taking place in Detroit, Michigan in the year 2004. The 4th season was when Enterprise finally became the show it was supposed to be, albeit too late, as the series had only been renewed that year in order to sweeten syndication deals with other networks so as to get the show close to that all-important 100-episode mark. In the end, 98 episodes would have to suffice. The 4th season focused on linking the series to the rest of the legacy and establishing the origins of many well-known elements and historical events in the franchise. Stormfront Part 1 and 2 may not have been the most thematically relevant opening episodes of the season, and they jettisoned the temporal Cold War arc that Archer had been dealing with up until then, but this season offered some real gems. Home is a fan-favorite episode, focusing on the return of Enterprise to Earth, the fallout that ensues, and providing some rich character development for T'Pol, Trip, and Archer in their own contained stories, and setting up the xenophobic plot thread on Earth that would later play out in a 2-part episode by season's end. The 3-part Arik Soon arc of Borderland, Cold Station 12, and The Augments sees Brent Spiner play the grandfather of Data, a man who had helped to create some genetically engineered superhumans, a 3-part epic story that references Khan from Space Seed and Star Trek II. The Vulcans had been written very poorly in the first 2 seasons of Enterprise, so it was nice that the 3-part Vulcan arc concerning a young T'Pau and explore the teachings of Surik would help to resolve this to make the Vulcans more moderate and more in keeping with their portrayal in the other Star Trek series. Affliction and Divergence were a 2-part Klingon story that explained why the Klingons in the original series looked the way they did. while also tying into a throwaway remark that Worf had made in the DS9 episode Trials and Tribulations. It was a nice piece of closure that tied up a continuity goof quite satisfactorily. Without doubt, the high point of the season, and perhaps the series, was In a Mirror Darkly, a two-part epic that explained the origins of the Mirror Universe, including a very clever retcon of the ending of Star Trek First Contact. Both episodes take place entirely in the Mirror Universe, and we get to see the evil alter egos of the Enterprise crew. The story ties into the original series episode, The Tholian Web, and now we learn that the Constitution-class USS Defiant from the 23rd century has been sent back in time to this alternate past for the Enterprise crew to commandeer and potentially use as a weapon to win the war for the Terran Empire. Demons and Terra Prime deal with a group of extremist insurrectionists led by John Frederick Paxton, who gains control of the Verteron array on Mars, which he plans to use on Earth if every non-human doesn't leave the planet at once. It's another fan-favorite story that further helps to develop the origin of the Federation, and if I'm honest, would have been a much better series finale than what we ended up getting. Sadly, Enterprise ended on a very poor story devised by Brannon Braga and Rick Berman. These Are the Voyages, pretty good name. It was meant as a love letter to the fans. It was anything but. A holodeck story in which TNG's Riker and Troy look back at the events of the final mission of Archer and co. This might have worked as a mid-season episode, so long as Trip hadn't been killed off so unnecessarily, but as a finale, it was very much the wrong choice, and something the cast and crew later regretted doing. That said, Enterprise gets a very bad rap from some fans, largely because of its first two seasons. The damage was clearly done in many people's eyes, it seems. But that doesn't change the fact that the show ended up contributing some excellent episodes into the franchise, and given the momentum it had by the fourth season, it's a great shame it wasn't given one more year to truly become the show it was meant to be. So was Star Trek Enterprise really that bad? Not at all. When it was on form, it delivered some fantastic sci-fi television, and I believe it's a worthy addition to Star Trek canon. I would argue much more so than Star Trek Discovery.